me introduce our four presenters. Trina Gribble is a registered architect. She is the architect member of the Historic Architectural Review Board. She's a former Historic Harrisburg board member and volunteer of many years, a resident of the Old Uptown Historic District, and she will talk about HARB and the process. Jeb Stewart here is a current preservation advisor to Historic Harrisburg Association, but he has an extensive background in city government, in Historic Harrisburg leadership, and in private sector involvement in historic preservation projects throughout the city. So very few people have had a more in-depth career in historic preservation in Harrisburg than Jeb. He was really here when it all started in the 1970s, and he's going to talk a little bit about that and how the districts were established and how the HARB was established. Frank Grumbine joined the city staff of just about a year ago. Frank is new to this process, but a great addition to the people that we work with. He is the preservation specialist in the City Planning Bureau, and also he is the administrator of the HARB board. So when you go to HARB meetings on the first Monday of every month, Frank is the guy who basically is the secretary to the committee. He puts out the agenda. He interfaces with all of the people that are going to be dealing with the HARB. He makes that thing work. And he also handles a lot of the city's public interface on issues pertaining to historic preservation and historic district. And lastly, A.J. Nee is the current chairman of the HARB. And during A.J.'s tenure, I would say that Harrisburg's HARB has really reached new levels of responsiveness, of professionalism, and sound decision making. And I've told them, I rarely find myself down at a HARB meeting to object to something or to complain. It's usually to applaud that great things are happening. And I really mean that. That is how it's been the last couple of years. And AJ and the current board members have worked hard to make this an extremely successful mechanism for enhancing our entire city, but particularly its historic district. AJ is going to be talking about the guidelines and also the updating process, which was really the impetus for our having this and future meetings. Each of them will have several minutes. We want to leave time for questioning. So with that, Trina, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, David, for hosting this event tonight. And thank you all for coming out. Wow, I hope everyone can see. It's quite a crowd we got here, and it's such a beautiful night, so I'm really impressed you're all here. To get started, I just wanted to also acknowledge the other members of the HARB who are here. Camille Bennett is here to my right. Jeremiah Chamberlain is here as well. Aunt Montgomery. And if anyone else is here that I'm missing, they are also members of the HARB. But we want to make our presentation tonight pretty quick because the point is we want to hear from you. We want to get your input on the guidelines to make sure that they are still relevant to our daily lives. So who's not here from the HARB? We also have Neil Heffelfinger on the board and April Rucker. They weren't able to be with us tonight. I'm sorry, I will speak louder. Thank you very much. We don't have a mic, so. So there are 7 residents on the HARB. We are volunteer members, and we want to make sure that we're protecting Harrisburg's unique character through its buildings, other features, and its streetscapes. There are 6 districts in Harrisburg, and we'll get to those definitions a little bit later. Our mission is really to save the the distinct character, and how, if we save that character, it will be important to benefit the community. And we know that we can still grow and prosper keeping that history in mind. Our goal is to really have pride of our past and its landmarks, and educate how the historic preservation is important to the community. we want to encourage that preservation, and we also know that it leads to a sustainable future. A little bit about how HARB works. If you live in the historic districts, what is in our purview is really the exteriors of your buildings, anything that is visible from the public way. We often look at new construction, or of course we would look at new construction in the districts. We also look at things like that are attached, like awnings and fences and signs. We also, of course, would look at demolition plans. And it doesn't matter if it's residential or commercial or another kind of public project. Things that we don't look at in the HARB are obviously properties not in the districts. We also would not look at building interiors. We're not it's not our purview to look at things on the exterior that you cannot see from the public way. And the board itself is not part of the enforcement aspect of the preservation and the applications. That comes through the The application process, probably several of you have been through it. If not, if you're planning to, this is what you would have to do. It's part of the building permitting process. To get a building permit, you would apply through the HARB for your certificate of appropriateness. And the applications are due the first Friday of each month, and then they're collected for the next month's board meeting, those are again held on the first Monday of the month. And before that, after you submit your application, thank you. After you submit your application, it may go through administrative review, and it may not have to go to the board if it's an in-kind replacement. Then those recommendations proceed to City Council. Some of the cases that have come across our table in the last couple years, I guess, windows and doors, awnings, and those weather vestibules for winter control, often at restaurants, fences, signage, additions, and renovations. Those are common cases. And how do we make our decisions? We have these guidelines, and those guidelines are based on the Secretary of Interior standards to give us a baseline for how to handle things like materiality. We want to make sure that it's long-lasting and it's in keeping with the property. We also want to consider the style, that it's appropriate and is in harmony with the existing building. And then the streetscape. We want to make sure that the streetscape stays intact and the character is not lost. So those are some of our considerations and how the guidelines and the Secretary of Interior standards help us to make those decisions. Now tonight we thought it would be very worth your while to hear more about how did we come up with the HARB in Harrisburg and its history. So Jeff, if you wouldn't mind.
Thanks. Do you have that?
If you want to.
Howdy all. The years 1972 to 1975 were very interesting in Harrisburg. They were scary, they were terrible, but they were great and energetic for what was coming up in the future. Of course, the 72 flood, as many of us know, was the catalyst for so much that occurred in terms of demolition of buildings and throughout the uptown area and the Shipoke area. Probably maybe a half of Shipoke was demolished. The southern end of Shipoke going down 9th Street and other areas of Shipoke, as well as areas uptown. And with that said, for example, the E.J. Stagpole Mansion next to Char's Restaurant was a perfect example of a beautiful mansion that was torn down. Maybe it didn't need to be, but it was flood damaged. Another one was the I.H. Dowdrick property at Front and Kelker Streets, another mansion that was torn down by the Redevelopment Authority. What occurred was urban renewal areas were created. The Penn Susquehanna urban renewal area was created as a flood recovery zone. And in those days, they tore down properties without really realizing whether they could be rehabbed. And the public consciousness really started to matriculate, and some of you folks were around at that time and may remember how devastating it was, and the fact that something had to be done. Above and beyond that, there were downtown landmarks that came down around the same time, not because of the flood, but because of other reasons. The Penn Harris Hotel was torn down in 1973 as an example, and the Historic State Theater, torn down in 1974. And Historic Harrisburg was involved with that, and the Orpheum Theater Association with some folks at that time. So a lot was happening over that several-year period that really raised something has to be done. Now, married with that was the emergence of the Harristown Plan. And that came about in 1973-74, around the same time. And on that was a demolition list, an acquisition list for demolition. Same thing with the urban renewal areas, acquisition list for demolition. So we had to be very cognizant and work with Harristown, which was done. And the intent was, look, from really Locust Street and Pine Street north to protect the view of the Capitol, the surrounds of the Capitol, and the emerging neighborhood, and what was beginning to be the, quote, back to the city movement, that should become a historic district. South of that is the central business district. We understand the need for growth, we understand the need for demolition for high-rise development, to increase the tax base, to increase the workforce downtown and so forth. So it was really a marriage of the two, which was great. It was good planning between the two organizations, the city and Harristown at the time. And in 1974, the first municipal district was created. And it was created to, at that time, up to Verbeck Street, I think was the original boundary. At that time, are we going too far? Are we going too far uptown? Will people buy into this? Can they be told what to do with their properties? But with good education, good outreach, particularly with the Historic Harrisburg Association, which was founded in '73, a year or two earlier, that was helpful, and good support in City Hall too, for that matter. So I want to include this as a major case that occurred in the early years of HARB, and HARB really took effect in mid-1974, and the intent was to really educate the business community about the fact that we now have a historic district, which is an overlay zone on zoning. It's just not a nice designation. It's an actual zoning tool, and you just can't tear down properties for surface parking or for other uses without going through the process that had, quote, police powers ascribed to it. This was a major case that I'd like to talk about because of what could have occurred. BP Oil came in, wanted to tear down 4 properties at 2nd and Forster Street for a gas station. And there are the 4 on the the southeast corner of 2nd and Forster. The review board, of course, said no. City Council upheld the review board, and it went to county court, and the court upheld the city, which was the first really good test case in being able to tell the community you just cannot tear down historic buildings for other uses because of the historic protections. It was appealed to Commonwealth Court, but for some reason it was yanked at the last minute because they probably figured they wouldn't succeed there. There were several other cases too. There were 2 properties on Pine Street, 125 and 127 Pine Street, to be demolished for what was First Federal Savings and Loan, that was a bank on 2nd Street, now the Federal Tap House. They wanted a drive-through. Said no to the owner. City upheld the review board, went to county court, court upheld the city. So the very early years was a test case on major demolition projects and proposals where the city was upheld and the review board was upheld, which maintained and furthered the credibility of the historic district legislation. The enabling legislation was only adopted several years earlier by the Commonwealth. Harrisburg was one of the first cities, or at least one of the first third-class cities in the state, to enact local historic district protections. So that's just a little thumbnail sketch on the early years.
Hello everybody, my name is Frank Rumbine. I'm the Historic Preservation Specialist for the City of Harrisburg, and I'm glad to be here, and thanks for joining us tonight. So historic districts overall in Harrisburg, like Jeb has elaborated on, have formed primarily from the 70s onto the 90s. To the left, you'll see municipal historic districts, which are locally planned as through the Historic Preservation Act of 1961 through the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, whereas on the right are National Register historic districts and also eligible National Historic Districts. So as you can see, nearly the entire city is eligible to have historic status, but we're here tonight to talk about municipal historic districts and the role that HARB plays in governing over what can or cannot occur in municipal historic districts. So there are 6 municipal historic districts. Here's Allison Hill. The period of significance for Allison Hill is roughly between 1880 and 1900. As you can see, there's various styles of architecture that are in the Allison Hill Historic District. It's also our smallest municipal historic district. Fox Ridge Municipal Historic District, not too far from here. The period of significance is roughly between 1860 and 1900. As you can see, there's also various styles of architecture mixed with masonry and framing type of structures. And of course we have Harrisburg Municipal Historic District. This encompasses much of the original borough of Harrisburg. So the period of significance is very, very wide relative to other historic districts. Roughly the period of significance is 1790 to 1920. So it's pretty broad, but we have a lot of different development patterns, and since it is the commercial center of the city. We also have Midtown Historic District. Midtown Historic District roughly has a period of significance from 1840 to 1910. Here, as well as many other historic districts, we have various styles of architecture, primarily Queen Anne, Italianate, Second Empire style architectural features. Next we have Uptown Historic District. Again, the period of significance is around 1880 to 1930. Uptown is more of, was developed as residential housing in the later 19th century as Harrisburg expanded into an industrial and commercial center. And we have Shipoke. Shipoke, like Jeb has said, has seen its fair share of flooding. And its period of significance is roughly 1850 to 1890. And as you know, flooding and climate change is a huge preservation concern that we have as a city. So we always keep flooding, primarily flooding, in our planning process. Benefits of historic preservation. What does preservation mean to you? Throw some words out.
Architectural art.
Yep. Anything else? Yep.
Connection.
Preservation can mean anything you want it to. Preservation encompasses geography, history, religion, class, work, play. There are cultural benefits of historic preservation. Preservation is the story of place. Each individual's memory is instilled into our sense of place, and the preservation of place, including landscapes and architecture, preserves our communities and our collective memory as a city. In a world of change, historic preservation gives us a sense of stability, timelessness, and sacredness. It allows us to interpret our past. Historic architecture is beautiful. Beauty is often overlooked as one of the primary reasons for historic preservation, but we all love old places. The variety of styles, use of materials, and craftsmanship gives us a sense of awe when we interpret our heritage. Our historic neighborhoods foster commerce, for they are desirable places to do business and live. Historic preservation allows us to learn and interpret the past, and in managing these districts, future generations will be given the same opportunity to be inspired by their ancestors as we have. There are social benefits to historic preservation. Historic preservation fosters socioeconomically diverse neighborhoods because managing historic communities stabilizes housing prices, allowing for all types of people of various classes and ethnicities to live within them. Historic neighborhoods improve the overall quality of life for its inhabitants, for they are walkable and well maintained, and historic districts have an improved sense of civic pride. Residents of historic districts usually make the conscious decision to live there. A collective sense of pride, community, and unity are all products of preserving our built environment. There are economic benefits of historic preservation. The rehabilitation of historic communities is largely beneficial to local workers due to the high level of specialization that it takes to rehabilitate historic structures. Therefore, the money spent on rehabilitation by property owners generally remains in the local economy, rather than giving that money to a large corporate store and that money going out of state. Historic districts foster the growth of small and local businesses due to the desirable streetscapes, walkability, and the supportive community which resides there, because they have such a great sense of pride and community in historic districts. The preservation of such structures also stabilizes the municipal tax base, which allows for the municipal and private reinvestment in these neighborhoods. Environmental benefits. There are many environmental benefits to historic preservation, but number one, the greenest building there is one that already exists. Historic preservation is one of the most sustainable practices we can undertake as a society today. It takes an immense amount of energy and materials to build and demolish structures. Reinvesting in existing structures saves the material and energy and time from sending all these materials to the landfill. Historic preservation also conserves land, as it eliminates the need for additional urban sprawl, thus utilizing already existing municipal infrastructure such as water and sewage. Demolition waste represents over 33% of landfill debris. 33% of all landfill debris is from construction waste. Historic structures also have a much longer lifespan because generally they were built to last. They were built to last in perpetuity, whereas much contemporary construction generally has a much shorter lifespan.
Once again, I'm AJ Nee, I'm the current chairman and president of the HARB, and I just wanted to thank everyone again for coming out here. I'm just going to go over why we're updating the historic design guidelines, and then we'll move quickly into comments back from you all. So the objectives, why we're doing this, is we want to make it as easy as possible for residents to access HARB and to understand the process, and to also know how to reference the guidelines. We want to give as much information up front to avoid any unnecessary work. We often have residents who don't know where to start. They live in historic districts and just need guidance, and a lot of time is wasted just making sure that you go through the process correctly. And we also wanted to give residents an opportunity to share. So that's why we're here. We recognize the process can be very confusing right now. That's why we just gave guidance on that and how the process works, and we intend to put that clearly into the new guidelines so that people can reference it. Some items in the guidelines haven't kept up with the times. The original document is fantastic, and I want to thank Jeb and everyone that worked on the original document. A lot is included in there, and to be honest, a lot of what's in there will be in the new guidelines. We're really looking to reorganize it, not redo it. We want to grow some of those things and just incorporate stuff like satellite dishes, utilities, things that maybe weren't referenced in the original guide. And then we also want to clarify some policies. We get in a lot of conversations at HARB about window materials, door materials. This is something that historic districts across the country deal with. And we've been talking a lot about this. I wanted to mention we've been working on this for almost a year already to get to this point. I think we're looking at moving more toward a metrics-based system than a materials-based system, because we had a lot of conversations about, there's some good wood out there that actually holds up better than a lot of the vinyl materials. I'm sorry, opposite. There's a lot of composite materials that hold up better than some wood materials. And so just flat out saying vinyl's not okay or wood is acceptable, it doesn't really work for us. And we'd love to hear your feedback on that as well. So once again, our job is not to dictate styles to you, and our job as a board is not to come and say you can't do what you want to do because you're in a historic district. Our job is actually to listen to you as residents in your individual historic districts and as a city to make sure that we're fostering growth, making sure the historic structures keep their integrity, and to allow new projects to be built, for rehabs to happen, for infill development to happen within the historic context. So I've heard members and other boards and other board presidents say stuff like cost is not a concern. I hate that phrase. Cost is very much our concern, because if we make these things cost prohibitive, then our buildings never get rehabbed and our neighborhoods fall into disrepair, which is not good for the historic structures either. So that's the origin of this process. We want to make sure all those things are included in it. And why we're here tonight, it's the first of many sessions on figuring out what you want to see in these guidelines as we reorganize them, as we include things in them. And I'm going to try and get through this to get some comments, but I also want to state that all our meetings are open to the public. We do listen to public comment. If you aren't able to communicate with us tonight, I'm hoping you're able to, but please come to our meetings. We have another one next Monday. We have them the first Monday of every month. And you know, if you see us on the street, I think we're all pretty open to communicating on this topic. We're all pretty passionate about it. So I'm just going to go over, we've got a draft table of contents. As I mentioned, we started this process over a year ago. And one of the first things we did was look at other historic districts and what they're doing with their historic guidelines. We took some best practices there, modified it to kind of work for the city of Harrisburg, and this is what we came up with. So I'm going to run through each of these sections really quickly. Section 1 is just an introduction. It's pretty much what we just talked about, the Pennsylvania enabling legislation, the districts, historic resources, and most importantly, how to use the guide. So as I mentioned, we want this to be a reference guide, so you can look into it and say, hey, I'm trying to add a window. Am I in a historic district? You can reference your address. What type of window is it? What type of building do I live in? What obstacles will I run into? Do I even have to go to Harb or go to City Hall to do this? That's what we're hoping to do in this how-to section. So you can get the information you need right up front. And then if you want to look deeper into the historic aspects of it and find out more information about why that decision exists, then you can keep reading into the guide.
This will be online or some digital file that we can access?
We haven't determined yet. We definitely want it to be online. We haven't determined whether the city website is capable of handling all the information. But I'll go through it. We have appendices to make the document living, and those will definitely be online because we'll be updating them. And then the original document is a static document that will live in perpetuity until someone in the future decides to undertake this process again. So section 2 is historic preservation principles. Again, it's pretty much what Frank just mentioned, just in a concise form. Section 3 is the Harb review process, which is what Trina mentioned earlier. It's just the explanation of the approval process, what you need to do to make it all happen, and whether or not you need to go through that process with your particular projects. And that's pretty much it. Section 4 is common architectural styles in the city, how to identify the style of your building. So if you reference it and you find out that you're in a historic district, you want to see what style, because some of the guidance will be based on your architectural style building. So, you know, a certain window might work, or a certain dormer or roof might work in one style but not another. We're hoping to include that in all of our guidance, and unique considerations for each. And then section 5 is the bulk of the document. It's citywide guidelines, and these are guidelines that are common across the city and aren't specific to neighborhoods. I'll get to it, but section 6 and beyond are the individual neighborhoods. We've recognized that certain neighborhoods and certain districts have unique characteristics that need considerations. I mean, in particular, Shipoke has flooding concerns. We run into that a lot because historically floods weren't considered in historic buildings. So we have to make some individual guidance for each neighborhood, and we want to make sure the residents in each district have a voice in how their district is formed. But getting back to citywide guidelines, these are the things that, unless we hear an objection, we all agree are standards based on the Secretary of Interior standards and past precedent here in Harrisburg. And we'll go through each of the individual sections. There'll be a section on windows, a section on doors, a section on garages, sidewalk cuts, satellite dishes, whatever, and you can reference in that. There will also be topics on zoning regulations, in-kind replacements, what it means to be an in-kind replacement, additions, demolitions, parking facilities, rights-of-way, all of that. And for each of those, you should be able to reference your style, your project, and get, here's more. It's an endless list. It's a very long section. It'll be a reference document. Here you can see even farther. Paint stains, accessibility, new construction, signage. These are all things we talk about every month on the board and have to make decisions based off past precedent and your input. And then, as I mentioned, sections 6 through 12 are just the individual historic districts and any additional guidelines that go into those sections. So if you see nothing on your project in that section, then you can go with the general citywide guidelines. And then section 13, this is where you can start to dig in deeper. So if you determine, my project needs to go through HARB, or I don't need to go through HARB, I can stop reading. But if you want to find out more, then we'll go into National Register of Historic Districts, places, list the districts, list eligible districts, talk about how you can modify your district or maybe include your property in a historic district or form a new one if you'd like. All of that, and that's later in the document. And then, as I mentioned, the appendices, where I'm hoping to list every address in the city, so you can just reference your address and say, hey, I'm this style, I'm in a historic district. That would be very helpful. I get that question most often. And then a section on a list of administratively approved materials and applications. There's a lot of things that aren't in the original guidelines that we've discussed as a board and agreed should just be approved by the Planning Commission because we always reach the same verdict as a board. Those become administratively approved and we'll just list those there, and that can be updated as needed. And then section C is a list of grants, credits, other resources that might be helpful in your project. So if you determine you need to move forward but you don't have the resources to complete a project, these might be some places you can go for any extra stuff. So I know that's a lot of information. This is, as I mentioned, the first public input session. After this, we're hoping to take some of your comments and form an actual document that we can go through at a later time. And as mentioned, there will be more review sessions, hopefully in each district. We might combine a few just to save some time and dollars. And as was mentioned earlier, we're a volunteer board, so we're doing this entirely on our own time and money, so please be patient with us. It's going to take a little longer than we hope. And then hopefully sometime in summer 2020 we'll be able to present some new guidelines that we can get approved by the city and move forward with. So with that, that's it. We definitely want to hear everything you have to say. Unfortunately, we don't have a microphone and it's a big room. We would love for comments in these 15 minutes if we have. So please make it short. One question per person. If there's time, we can talk after. Again, we're all accessible outside of this. And we've got Anne here taking notes to make sure that we hear everything. So I don't know if you just form a line.
Also, we have some 3x5 cards and hopefully some pens out, I think, on a table back there if you want to pass them around. Because 15 minutes may not be enough to get through everyone. If you have questions, comments that you would want to write down, we're happy to collect those. And of course, we have our follow-up sessions to collect more since we're rushed for time.
And
so,
as I mentioned, this historic guideline conversation is on our agenda pretty much every month until it's done in perpetuity. So it's in other business. You might have to sit through some cases and see how the process works, but at the end of each meeting, we would love to hear more comments. If you're unable to provide comments here, if you have friends or family who couldn't make it, we definitely want to hear your input. So I don't know how many people have comments. I don't know if we should form a line or just raise hands. All right, we can do hands. So yes, sir. Yeah.
How does a district on the potential list become a recognized district?
So the map that you saw of the eligible historic districts, that's regulated through the state SHPO office, which is the State Historic Preservation Office, and then they work with the national, the Department of Interior to nominate these districts. So Those districts were what you saw were for the national register, which Harb doesn't have any purview over. And if you're asking if you'd like to form a new municipal historic district, that would be nominated through everybody like yourselves, and it would go through the planning bureau, and it would be an internal process with the city.
Yeah, I'm thinking specifically Academy Manor where
Yep.
I live. I saw it on the list. Does that have to come from a majority of property owners in that area? Does it go to Harb first? Does it go to the city?
So we recently reviewed Academy Manor. It is eligible for a National Register nomination through the National Park Service, but it is obviously also eligible for municipal status. The process doesn't come up that often, so not very well versed on how it comes together. But you petition city council to pass a new historic district.
And this is one of the sections will be included in the
Yeah.
document. It's driven by the State Historic Preservation Office, and they're definitely the ones that go to for guidance because they control, the
Yeah,
enabling
they're not-
legislation controls the process. So in terms of Academy Manor, I know that there is a process moving to try and turn that into a historic district, and we did a walking tour of it, 4 months ago now, as part of
What are the boundaries?
process. Well, the boundaries aren't set, but for those who aren't familiar, it's the area kind of between Italian Lake, the river, Division Street, and
Yeah.
3 blocks north of Division.
Yeah.
So yes. I think I saw one more hand back here first. Yep.
Any question? Does the new guidelines that you're developing have like restrictions on what type of, or what color paint you use for like your house or something?
Part of the enabling legislation prevents us from regulating paint color. So we can determine whether things are requiring paint, but we can't determine colors at all. That's something that we couldn't even do even if we wanted to. It's just not under our purview. Yes, I think there was one more question behind you first.
I have the paint
Oh,
question.
okay, yes. Sorry. Thank you.
Now, I was going to ask, for some of us that have had window questions in the play for a while, I realize the city cannot endorse particular vendors, but it would be sure helpful if somebody could sit and say, you know, we've had great reviews here, we've had terrible ones there. Because the soonest I found is with Bosnian painters, and that's a year out waiting time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
and I
they'd
don't-
love to sell vinyl windows in Midtown if anybody's interested.
And this is a particular frustration that I know as a resident that wants to update.
Repeat the question?
We're not allowed to endorse particular vendors, but in terms of materials and windows and doors, it would be nice to have a list of options that have been approved that you can start with. It's
Well, when you were speaking of things that we always approve, that is mainly
and
from a material basis.
yes, and the things that we approve in those administrative approvals will be materials or certain styles or certain metrics, so you can go from there. We don't like to approve administratively particular brands because, you know, the manufacturer could change them, or there could be another competing brand that does the exact same thing. And so that's why it's a particular point of frustration for us, because I know I would love that list too. It would be a lot of help. But we can definitely make it more clear on where to find those metrics, what you're looking for, and yeah. Yes.
Is there now a requirement, and if there isn't, I recommend there be one, that before a property is transferred, that the seller has to disclose that the property's in a disclosure?
We've discussed that, and I don't remember what the city said about that.
Used to have buyer notification. We used to have buyer notification.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, and on the buyer notifications, whenever you sell a property, you have to take out a buyer's notification, and with that buyer's notification, it lets you know whether it's in the flood zone and if it's a storage area.
It is required then? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I know there's another person before me, but to that point, I know that's not always enforced because I've purchased 2 properties in Old Uptown District and not one time been informed that there were specific requirements based on preservation rules. So I think it's something that probably needs some work in terms of enforcing that. Because that actually was my question, because it comes up with like the window thing
Yep,
years later after you purchase the property.
absolutely.
There are people that'll sell the properties without getting a buyer.
Yeah, the closing.
Sorry, just wanted to make sure the room can hear. So,
You can't.
so the question came up again. It was made a comment that maybe that is not always enforced, and I don't think it is always enforced. Maybe it, but we were just commenting on where it's.
Yeah, it's not enforced always because people don't come into the city to actually apply for the buyer's notification.
Notifying that your house is in a historic district before you purchase it. And then I saw another question over here. Yeah.
You talked about moving from a yay or nay type of decision when, reviewing something such as a material change on an exterior and moving towards a metric-based approval process. Could you talk about that a little bit more, what that looks like?
Yeah, it's not necessarily yay or nay. As with every decision, our board, I don't speak for the board. Our board sometimes makes split decisions based off past precedent and the way we're reviewing cases. In terms of materiality, in the past, it's always been certain materials are just kind of blacklisted. Like you come up with a vinyl window and we're like, no, you can't do vinyl, without even considering it. And then certain materials are just approved. Wood. Every wood window is great. We are pushing back on that idea. Because there are some wood materials that aren't that great, and there are some composite and vinyl materials that are that great. So we've been kind of soliciting opinions from other historic districts to try and see what the most important aspects of windows and doors and those items that you put into your building that you don't necessarily build, what is important and what's not important to include in metrics. So theoretically, if the product you're looking at has longevity, weatherability, paintability.
A lot of it comes down to what, a window's a great example, and it's one of the most contentious issues. So, how does it fit inside the opening of the window? That's important. The sight line is important. The type of mutton bars that are dividing your glass, that it is divided glass or simulated divided glass. So these are the criteria that we'll put together to give you a value of a product rather than just a blanket statement, because unfortunately the new growth woods aren't holding up as long, so we want longevity for our city. That's the point of this. So, but there are some superior wood windows out there, and there's some other composite materials that we really want to consider fairly and for the betterment of the city.
I think I saw one more question before. Okay, come. Yes, go.
I just have a question that kind of goes to the root of this, which is that generally historic architectural review boards are reviewing standards based on the date of a building's original nomination or incorporation into the district. So I'm curious, I think maybe the public wants to hear too a little bit about what resources are you referring to for documentation of the historic structures, because the issues about windows, et cetera, generally go to what was original, what was the original site line, at least the date of nomination. So that's kind of a benchmark for most historic architectural review boards. Okay, if it was nominated in 51, maybe what had already been altered to that date is appropriate, or it really needs to go back to 1900. So I'm personally, as an architect, interested to know what archives you're resourcing and what's available to the public, and if SHPA has more archive resources for you, or where does the public go to get the information about an original or a 1900 era or 1960 era photo of that building?
Well, to your point, first place we look is Secretary of Interior standards, and then we look at past precedent and our historic guidelines here for every decision we make. And the reason we have a board is it's case by case. There's never a blanket includes everything. It's especially difficult with period alterations. We've had a couple cases where the original building's covered up by a very dated facade, and it's do we want to preserve that dated facade? How far back are we looking? The 70s are considered historic in a lot of districts now. Do we want to preserve that? And that's what that's why we have this conversation and want to update for those things. In terms of referencing the period, the Planning Bureau for every case gives us the age and out the building. I'm not sure where you get that information.
So generally, the architectural features that are recommended for buildings come from their period of significance, which would be their period of high style or the period of construction or thereafter. And if these buildings have later additions, such as a storefront or a different architectural feature that has retained historic value over time, we want you to retain that. So if it's a Victorian Gothic building with an Art Deco storefront, those both have historic value because they both add texture and they add to the story of place. So it's all contextual, like AJ was saying. It's not, there's no blanket statement. It all depends on the structure itself, its surroundings, its streetscape. So it's hard to say, but generally the sources that we use are archival sources from our archives, our city archives, our city maps, historic secondary sources. So we use a variety of sources, especially when I'm writing each case report for each case for Harb. I do so the primary and secondary sources vary depending on the structure itself. So, and most of these are available to the public as long as you're willing to do the research. So I'd like to be a little more detailed, but like AJ said, it's all contextually based on the house, based on the structure, and based on its location.
If people have questions, they can always call you before they start a project.
Yeah, and everybody is welcome to call me regarding any historic preservation or cultural resource management issues in the city, and I'd be happy to do research for you on your property.
And then I want to add to that, because everything is a case-by-case basis, we start at a macro level and work our way down to a micro level with every single project. So there's certain things that are just standard by, Secretary of Interior standards. Then there are certain things that we as a city have decided are important. Then there are things that we as a district have decided are important. And then at each individual meeting, we open it up for comment. And if neighbors want to say, we want to preserve this aspect of this building, but it's not so much important for this aspect of the building. I think if we hear it's not important, we kind of defer back to the Secretary of Interior standards. But we do make decisions based on what people in the surrounding community want with every case, every single time. So it's hard to give just a simple blank slate for that. So a question over here first. Yes.
Yeah, I have a really weird house that actually exists in Bubble, almost detached from the old Uptown district, because the rest of the block was raised when they built Capitol Heights, I think it's called, and my property, I can see on my deed, it says adverse. It was an adverse action against the condemnation. And it doesn't match the style of anything around it. So my question is, before we make plans that we then may have to redo after bringing it to you, what's the proper channel to find out about your building? I have the only front to back gambrel roof that I've been able to find in Harrisburg, as one example. And I don't know what's appropriate. Where do you go? Do you go to the Historic Association? Do you guys volunteer even more of your time?
I mean, a lot of the times the answer is yes, we do volunteer more of our time because we care. But that's also why we're including other guides. You can go to HHA for guidance. You can go to anyone for guidance. We want to make sure that all the styles are included as much as possible. Unfortunately, there will be some unique styles that aren't included in every guide. And for those cases, it never hurts to call the Planning Bureau.
Yep.
We have a historic preservation officer that can hopefully answer questions, and that's the first line of defense.
And like I was saying earlier, every building is not in a bubble by itself. It is associated with all the other buildings around it.
Mine is surrounded by vinyl siding.
Yeah, but it still has a relationship to the other buildings around it. Even though you say it doesn't, it was built there for a reason. It has a geographical purpose there. So
I wish I knew more about that.
and that's part of it. Everyone.
I wish I knew why the rest of it was all torn down.
Yeah, and you won't learn everything at once. You'll learn everything. You'll learn a little bit here and a little bit there about your structure. But it takes a lot of time to research your property. To go to the courthouse, do a deed search, review everyone who's owned it, and then and archival research, like I was saying earlier, you go to the archives, you try to contact previous owners. So it takes a lot of legwork to figure it out. But once you start peeling back layers, if you're doing construction, then you can really see the periods of significance over time. So especially with vinyl siding, you don't know what's under there, clapboard, asbestos. Yeah, so
I have 3 courses.
yeah, so there you go. So and it's difficult to have a blanket statement saying that this is where you go for information because your building is unique, or yeah. So it's tough to say, but it takes a lot of time to do research. It's like a research project. So
So at least to get some pointers of where to.
and you can feel free to call the planning bureau. I can come meet with you and review your property and give you some feedback. Yeah.
Now,
Info for the planning bureau.
My cards, I put my cards on the table back there, and I also have extra cards with
And
me.
also, where do you meet? Where are your meetings?
for Harb, we meet in the city government center,
Room 2.
kind of in the police annex portion, but if you go to the second floor, there are signs directing you to the room. And it's 6 p.m. the first Monday of every month, except for December.
Except for December. Room 213.
And I hate to do this, we're running out of time because I see extra hands. I saw 2 hands, so we have room for 2 more questions up here. And then after, we'll stay out in the lobby, you can answer questions informally. And then as mentioned, please write down all questions or comments on the cards in back, or feel free to stop by our meetings this coming Sunday, next Monday. This coming Monday at 6 p.m. We'll be at City Hall, City Government Center, with another meeting. So I saw a question over here first. Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing that people are really confused about where to start.
Mhm.
And I think that sometimes because of that, they just say, I'm just gonna do it. They do a little bit, they got jobs, they got families, they got, they're busy. And so they just do it, and they're wrong. We see some examples of that. You can see a whole nice row of houses and somebody's got a white steel door in the middle of it. It glares at you, So what happens then?
So the comment was, sometimes people get busy, don't know where to start, and actually do the project before they know there's a problem. With all of those, we do after the fact hearings, and sometimes we do approve cases after the fact if they meet the standards. They just know that they were supposed to go through the process. I think you still have to file the paperwork, but there's no fine.
After the fact review, there is.
Yeah.
Yes.
There is a fine
Yes.
for after the fact review. Okay,
Yes.
so there is a fine for doing it after the fact.
But
And it's-
they've
but-
done something glaringly wrong,
Well, and that's why we are trying to make it as clear as possible up front, because we want to avoid that confusion as much as possible. The last thing we want to do is make these projects more expensive. So that's why we are discussing putting this on the website. We would like to make a clear thing to put with your house when you purchase it, so that you know you're in a district, and we want to make sure it's referenceable so that we don't run into those issues. And then I saw one more question here, and then unfortunately that's it for questions, sorry.
Goes back to windows. You guys say you don't push a particular company, but everybody I know in downtown who has asked about windows in the last few years has either been told one of 2 things. You can put wood windows back in, or you can call renewal by Anderson. Those will be approved. Which, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with their product, they're fine, but they're a very expensive option. Or do you have any examples of other similar products by other companies that you have approved?
I can't say brands.
And why are they always told to go to them?
I know no one in our board would never say go to a particular company,
Well, somebody
but
involved in the process is telling them to go to renewal.
and I think we do recommend certain composite materials.
We
And
have
Yeah,
administratively approved specific materials, so you don't have to come to the review board.
right.
That is not the only materials that are.
Okay,
We've
there are
administrated.
other materials other than wood that
Yes.
you will accept.
So you're using the term Fibrex and Renewable by Anderson.
Well, that's
that
the one
particular
everybody-
product has been administratively approved because every single month there will be windows that come before it, and they're going to be approved every single month because basically somewhere in the back is legal counsel. Past precedence holds forward, so we can't reject, this next project using the same materials. Now, there are other composite wood materials out there, and if somebody brought them before us, we have approved them. I don't know their brand names.
Okay,
Um,
but you have approved
yeah.
other things.
Yeah, I can't name off.
Yeah, we approve other materials, other brands all the time. We just bring it before and show that it works and
Yeah, I
we
mean,
approve it.
we want to make it as nice as possible and simplify the process. So if there is something that's always getting approved every single month without discussion, we don't want to make you sit and wait a month to get your project done. That just,
Yep,
people.
because it's only once a month.
It's only
We
once a
want-
month.
we
People's
want to
lives are
make this
busy.
happen.
We want to make it as easy as possible to apply for things, to encourage people to apply for things.
But there is a big misconception with a lot of people that live here that it's either wood or them. And, you know, it'd be nice. if
Personally, I would
there-
personally I use wood.
Stop spreading that rumor, people. Come on. All right. Well, so
I mean, I love
unfortunately,
wood, but it's not.
Fortunately, we can't answer more questions. We've already done 10 minutes into the next session, so we want to hear all of your feedback. So as I mentioned, fill out those cards. Some of us will be up front to answer a few questions, and then if you don't see us and if this tonight, come back next Monday. Come to any of our hard meetings. We want to hear you through this process. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.